Hello again. In this session of our material, we're going to look together at three broad areas which I'm trusting are going to be of use to you. First one is, why do we have rules for the United Church of Canada and how did they come to be? Secondly, what does it mean to be professionals who act in an ethical fashion? And third, what does it mean for our regular practice of ministry? So, topic one, why do we have rules for the United Church of Canada and how did they come to be? Well, the technical term for our subject of study in this course is polity. The word polity comes from the same root as politics. Polity is the term for the way in which any group, organization, society organizes itself, and any group of people has rules and standards for their life together. And that can be as simple as who does the chores around the house, and as complex as the constitution and laws of an entire nation. It's all polity. No movement of people survives the death of its founder without some sort of polity. Think of any great movement you know, and it's true of the church as well. When Jesus was alive, all of the questions could be referred to him. He would make all the decisions. Any decisions about what to do and how to do it, any questions about belief and practices could go right to the source. And the pattern is repeated over and over again in history. But as we read the letters of Paul and the book of Acts, what we are seeing is polity developing. We see different ways of choosing folks for different tasks. We see different ways of making decisions. That's polity evolving. But why do we need rules anyway? Can't we just trust people? Well, written rules are important for a number of reasons, and I'd like to highlight some of them. First of all, written rules keep things honest and fair for everyone. Maybe you've come to a group as a newcomer and you didn't know all the players, you didn't know the standards and expectations and relationships. That can be an uncomfortable spot. Having the rules written down might feel cumbersome. One effect of that, though, is that everybody knows what the rules are. When the rules are only known to some people, it's very easy for injustice to occur. That's why we need rules that are written down so that everyone can see them. Secondly, rules keep things honest and even for the participants. And even if we don't assume any malice or ill will, it is human nature to find the quickest and easiest solution to a question or a problem. Not everything done in the church follows the rules. I know that may be a shock to you, but there it is. Not everything follows the rules. And sometimes we find what seems like an easy answer. It can be unjust to some people. For instance, if we said everyone can attend the meeting by video conference, that assumes that everyone has access to the technology. And you can pile up a lot of examples around that. Number three of many we could list, written rules play a role in defending the rights of individuals and of the church. Think about that. We live in an age of increasingly complex expectations. And we can't assume that we automatically know what is good for everyone. We also live in a time of increasing attention to rights and due process. I think those are good things. But it also means that we have to follow our own rules, which presumes we know them. And the civil courts of Canada have repeatedly ruled that the polity of the United Church of Canada is just and follows the norms of legal practice if the polity is followed. When we make it up because we don't know the rules, we make errors. That can lead to big trouble and even to us getting sued. Deservedly so. So here's an important principle of governing in the United Church of Canada. Polity follows policy. Polity follows policy. In other words, the first step is to determine what we wish to do and why. That's policy. Only then is it time to write the rules. That's polity. So how did we get to where we are now? Well, here's a quick history lesson. The history of Protestant Canada is marked by many different divisions that came with settlers from the old country. For instance, by the mid-1800s, there were 16 different brands of Presbyterians, there were 10 different types of Methodists, and so on. By the turn of the 20th century, most Canadian Protestant Christians looked and behaved in quite similar ways. They had discovered that the divisions which may have made sense in the old country had no relevance in the new colonies. And so the latter part of the 19th century saw a wave of successive unions. Presbyterians joining with Presbyterians, joining with Presbyterians, and similarly in the Methodist family. And that's important because when it came to discussing the union that led to the United Church of Canada, there was only one Methodist church, one Presbyterian church, and one Congregationalist church to do the talking. And the idea of overcoming differences and joining was in the air, as well as a tendency to accept differences within a broad tent without needing to divide the church. And so it is that a basis of union, a draft basis of union, was presented to the negotiating churches in 1906. It was based on drawing together the common threads. It didn't try to choose between different aspects of the heritage. It tried to accommodate differences. Here's an example. The Methodists were committed to Arminianism. Arminianism is the doctrine of a Dutch theologian by the name of Arminius, who was dear to the heart of John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement. Arminius held that while God initiates the process of salvation through the gift of the Holy Spirit, the individual must respond. It is within our power, our freedom, to accept or reject the gift of grace. Meanwhile, the Presbyterians, the descendants of John Calvin, followed the doctrine of election. In its simplest form, election means that the saving grace of God chooses whoever it wants, and human beings do not, indeed they are incapable of, making a decision in response to that choice. And the United Church of Canada managed to make a way between those. And you can see that worked out in a number of the articles of faith of the basis of union, found near the front of the manual. Now, this is not a course in United Church doctrine, but it is important to recognize what was uppermost for the framers of the basis of union. They were gripped by a vision of what the church could be and could do. That to them was far more important than niceties of doctrine and theology. Their goal was a truly national Canadian Protestant church, a church that could meet the demands of Christianizing a new country and a new century, a church that would be focused out there in outreach and mission rather than internally. And so when it came to building the structure of the church, the framers of the basis of union found that although the various parts had different names, each of the three churches coming together had similar organizational bodies and similar officers. So putting them together was relatively straightforward, and even the differences could be overcome. Congregationalists and Presbyterians had deep commitment to the freedom of the congregation. Methodists were strongly invested in the importance of a wider connection. Both commitments found a place in the new structure. The founders of the new church asked the question, what is the church for? Now, it's entirely possible that they might have asked the question, what is the church? And there were other voices at the turn of the 20th century wrestling with the question of the role and the composition of the church. It was certainly a live theological question at the time, but the founders didn't ask that. They asked, what is the church for? And they answered the question very simply. The church is for effective deployment of resources for mission. Thus, instead of wrestling with the theology and history behind their structures, they simply looked to blend them. So we do not end up with anything that's particularly new and exciting in terms of a vision for the church, but rather decisions about what forms of organization would work best for the overarching goal of mission. New names were applied to familiar structures and organizations. So, the highest court was to be called a general council. which is a Congregationalist term. The General Council was presided over by a moderator, a venerated Presbyterian designation. The various geographic territories of the nation were divided into annual conferences, a Methodist term, meetings that were composed of equal numbers of laity and clergy exercising authority over the ministry in terms of admission and discipline of clergy. The more local expression of organization was the presbytery, responsible to maintain oversight of pastoral charges, supervise education of candidates for ministry, licensing and inducting and supervising ministers within its area. And the presbytery was composed of lay representatives from pastoral charges, together with ministry personnel, active, retired, and retained on the roll, living within its bounds. Most of those decisions were very quickly and easily made. The records of this subcommittee, the organizing subcommittee, are very brief because they just agreed on a whole lot of things. But there were two matters that threatened to be deal breakers. They were deal breakers because the negotiating churches started out from very different places. The first one was, how does anyone get to be a minister? The second one, how are ministers assigned to their pastoral offices? The churches varied widely in the ways they tested ministerial candidates. Congregationalists would question them closely about their beliefs and experiences, but did not impose any formal subscription to a creed. That means that you didn't have to say that you agreed with a particular expression of faith. Methodists were inclined to inquire carefully into the personal habits of the candidate, but they were rather more loose when it came to issues of theology and doctrine. Presbyterians, on the other hand, were less concerned about personal habits, and they laid great emphasis on, quote, an oath of fealty to the doctrines and courts of the church. So you can see the difference. Congregationalists are very much opposed to using the creeds of a previous generation. They were very committed to the idea that individuals have to express their faith for themselves. In one of my congregations in another part of the country, I had two English Congregationalists who were part of the United Church of Canada. And I noticed all the time that when we used the United Church Creed, they would stand with everybody else, sort of in solidarity, but they would not say it. It was not part of their Congregationalist tradition. And so after much discussion, it was decided to leave inquiry and supervision of candidates to the presbytery. But what could you ask them? The Congregationalists steadfastly refused to accept any form of creedal test or subscription being put to candidates. In other words, they refused to allow candidates to be asked to agree to a specific formula of faith or sign on the dotted line. And from that often difficult period, which lasted over a year, came the decision to require of each candidate essential agreement to the statement of the doctrine of the United Church. And this is supplemented in the ordination, commissioning, and recognition and admission service with three brief questions about Christ, divine call, and belief in the Holy Spirit. That one could have been a deal breaker. Even more contentious was the placing of ministers. How did ministers and congregations get connected in a pastoral relationship? Well, the Methodists had a tradition of a stationing committee that went back to the earliest days of itinerant ministry. Every year, the stationing committee assigned ministers to circuits, and the standing committee was the most powerful committee of the annual conference. And it was entirely possible that someone could go off to conference thinking they were living securely in one appointment and discover that in 3 weeks' time, they and their family were supposed to be someplace else in the conference. And that pattern continues today in the United Methodist Church south of the border. Excuse me. Now, over the decades, some large congregations had managed to circumvent the committee and they secured the minister they wanted. That didn't change the fact that for Methodists, itinerancy was seen to be the core of genuine ministry, and the stationing committee was a key link in this historic itinerant scheme. The Presbyterians and Congregationalists were equally tied to the call system, whereby the congregation gets to choose its ministerial leadership. The Methodists thought that a call left a minister too much under the thumb of a congregation, while the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists saw the stationing system as dictatorial and undemocratic. The result was typical United Church. A congregation would call a minister, but the appointment would be vested with the settlement committee, which shall comply, quote, as far as possible with the expressed wishes of ministers and pastoral charges. The compromise was made possible because all of the churches had, in fact, developed mixed practices which moved away from the stated policies that they inherited. Where do we find the rules of the United Church of Canada? They're found in the Manual of the United Church of Canada, which consists of several parts. The first 16 pages, at least in the 2019 version, are background, histories, historic apologies to First Nations, and so on. Then comes the Basis of Union, which has two sections. The first section is the Doctrine section, which contains the 20 Articles of Faith, the 1940 Statement of Faith, the New Creed, and the Song of Faith. The second portion of the Basis of Union is the Polity section, divided into background, the church, communities of faith, regional councils, denominational council, denominational office of vocation, clusters, and networks. Think of the Basis of Union as being the Constitution, if you like. It's the Constitution of the United Church of Canada. And then there is a section on ministry personnel and one on administration. The next major block of material is the bylaws, divided into chapters by topic. And then comes the definition section, which can be very important because sometimes words are used in a very specific way. And then finally some appendices with useful information. One crucial tool missing from the 2019 manual is an index. In previous editions, this was an invaluable tool which would help you find the references to a particular subject in different places, and that's been taken from us. You can employ the search function that's built into your PDF reader, but I find it not as helpful. Now, if you compare the 2019 edition of the manual to the 2010 edition and all those before it, you will see some major differences. The 40th General Council, meeting in 2009, decided that the manual as it existed was too large, too difficult to comprehend, and had more detail than was generally needed and not easily adapted or changed. So we have a new form of the manual that is supposed to carry the bare bones of intentions with the details being left to hyperlinks. The intention was to take out of the manual material most people don't need most of the time while making the most of current processes and so on readily available through the most current technology. We could talk sometimes about my feelings, pro and con, about that change, but the reason I have the manual in two different forms is to help you gain some insight into some of the details that the newer format does not contain for decisions of polity which are ongoing. Now, changing the manual occurs in very clear ways. Those things that are in the bylaws can be changed by a vote of General Council. The bylaws are changed at every meeting of General Council. Some of them are anyway. And so it's crucial that you have an up-to-date edition. There's very little that can mess up life faster in the church than people working from out-of-date rules. The manual and new policies take effect about a year after the General Council meets. More major changes, those that involve changing the basis of union, are done through something called a remit, a process that we'll talk about later in the term. If we switch gears just for a couple of minutes, I just want to introduce the concept of professional ethics as we will be looking at it this term. Professional ethics is the subject of how we behave in our role as ministers. And so let me give you some questions to think about. First of all, what are ethics? If I were to ask you that, what are ethics? Well, one answer is a set of moral principles. Next question, are all ethics the same? Is everybody's ethics the same? No, because ethics are derivative. They're derivative, which means that whatever ethical norms or standards we follow have to come from somewhere, from some place, from some source. They don't just appear out of clear blue sky. We're drawing them from some other commitments. Well, what are the ramifications of that? Well, one ramification is that if we are going to share a set of ethical principles or ethical standards, then we need to agree on a source and how we would understand that source. Where would the United Church ethics derive from? Well, the easy answer to that one is the Bible. But the next question, obviously, is the Bible an easy source to derive ethics from? That's a more complex question. It often depends on which portion or portions of Scripture we give priority to and the methods of interpretation and understanding that we employ. For instance, the social ethics of the Southern Baptist are very different from those of the United Church of Canada, and yet each would firmly and resolutely claim that their ethics are based on Scripture. So that means that if professional ethics are going to be more than just individual in nature, they have to have at least two components. First of all, the individual orientation to ethical behavior. And second, a commonly held expression of those commitments in concrete situations. In other words, while we hope and trust that you will be ethical individuals, there are also certain applications of those ethics in daily life which seem so important that they need to be written down so that they can be held in common. So for the most part, we trust our ministers to behave ethically, but we also accept that there are certain particularly fraught or complex or dangerous, if you like, situations where the rules need to be written down. Which leads us to another term, profession. What does that word mean to you? Do you feel that in entering the ministry, you are entering a profession? Well, a profession by definition is a calling required specialized knowledge and intensive preparation. It also implies high standards of achievement and conduct. So let me ask you again, in preparing for ministry, do you see yourself as joining a profession? Why or why not? Do you see dangers or benefits from defining ministry as a profession? Those are the sorts of questions that we'll be diving into throughout the term. I won't always be saying, now we're doing ethics, because ethics runs through and through our study of the organization of the church and of leadership. We just might want to have it as a sign above our computers. What are the ethical implications of this particular aspect of our life together? For the last couple of minutes of this input session, I want to send you on some treasure hunts, looking at definitions and finding your way through the manual. The first term I want you to look up is the church. I want you to do that by finding section 4.1 to 4.3 in the Polity section of the 2010 edition. Have you found it? You may need to pause the recording. Given what you already know about the why the manual is built the way it is, why do you think the information is included here? Remember, this is the Constitution. If I told you that 4.3 is an addition made in 2010, what do you think the reasons for including it might be? Please note that as far as the United Church of Canada is concerned, administratively the unit of organization is the community of faith. And this term was was introduced to allow different configurations of people to take a place in the denominational structure: chaplaincies, camps, house churches, and so on. I think that's a great idea. It allows us to respond to the ways in which people are organizing themselves. There is, however, a certain lack of clarity about whether a former multi-point pastoral charge is one or several communities of faith. For instance, is a 2-point charge one community of faith or two? And the best answer I've been able to receive for that question is that it will depend on the covenant they enter into with the region, about which we will say more on a later day. The second term I want you to wrestle with is the order of ministry. The order of ministry. This is one instance where our language has great difficulty keeping up with our practice. In the good old days of 1925, everyone knew who were the ministers and who were the laity. Ministers were these sorts of people and they did these sorts of things. Since then, as our practice has evolved to express a greater recognition of the variety of gifts that God's people bring, we have added a variety of expressions of ministry. We've also tried a variety of titles to try and incorporate all of that rich variety of activity. For a while, we referred to paid accountable ministry, which, besides being a truly inelegant mouthful to say, gives off all sorts of bad vibrations about people who are not paid. Are they also not accountable? Well, that's an interesting concept of the Christian life. So what you will find in current editions of the manual is that throughout, the designation ministry personnel is employed. This has also been important in clarifying balance in those courts where membership between laity and ministry personnel is crucial. There's always great confusion with folk like designated lay ministers. Are they lay or ordered? The good rule of thumb is if it's acting like a minister and being paid to be a minister and present because it's doing things that ministers do, then it's a minister for counting purposes. Under the three-council model, however, the regular push for lay and ministry personnel balance seems to have received far less emphasis than it had in our past. I'd like you to turn to the Polity section 10.0 in the 2019 edition. So 10.0 in the 2019 edition. Take a moment to find that. Consider item 10.1. What do you think that means for you? 10.1 reads that the pastoral relationship, when initiated by call, shall be without time limit. In the 2010 version, section 9.1, the reading is the pastoral relationship, when initiated by call and or settlement, shall be without time limit. That has to do with the effective absence of the settlement process, which used to be the method by which ordinands and commissionands were attached to their first appointment. We've set that aside in the last decade and a bit so that people find their own initial calls. Staying with the 2019 manual, turn to Polity 13.3. Reflect on the fact that of all the worship services that we conduct, only the ordination and commissioning services have this degree of detail prescribed within the basis of union. Why do you think that is? None of the other worship services that we conduct, none of the other parts of any worship service that we conduct are recorded in the manual, just this one. Why do you think it's felt necessary to include that? Still in the 2019 manual, I want you to turn to section I2, which is in the bylaws. The United Church of Canada is much more directive than some denomination about seeing that its ministry personnel are adequately paid. Of course, adequately is a word open to wide interpretation, but you are at the end of decades of clergy struggling to be adequately remunerated for the work that we do. And so to help in that, each year the General Counsel Office publishes a document listing the minimum salary, etc., that can be paid. So you'll often hear people talking about their salary in terms of its relationship to the minimum. I'm being paid minimum or minimum plus 5% and so on. The document also specifies things like travel allowances. You are, of course, free to try and negotiate anything you want above the minimums, but you are secure that in knowing that no community of faith can pay less than the minimum and do it legally. Over the past 3 to 5 years, the United Church has been moving away from a system of salary plus housing allowance to a comprehensive salary that includes both in a single figure. And part of that has to do with the challenges around calculating and securing adequate housing allowances. It used to be that there was a calculation based on the fair rental value of a church and the home in the area of the church with certain furnishings and so on, and always got into a great deal of hoofleroy about what the fair rental value would look like. And the fact of the matter is that, according to research, fewer than a small percentage of clergy actually live in the neighborhood of their congregations. Many clergy are commuting half an hour or more, which may put them in a different community. So that was quite messy. And so now there's a clear housing allowance figure, cost of living figure, that is associated with a particular congregation. You can live anywhere you want, and this is the housing portion of your salary. And those cost of living areas across the country are based on the selling prices of real estate, which some people would argue that the buying and selling of real estate has only a tangential relationship to rental value, but these are the figures that are being used. And those numbers are reviewed on a set schedule and in some cases have proven to be misleading. For instance, in some location, there are high tourist season rentals, which skew the rental value of a place entirely out of any reason. So there are some places where that has to be negotiated and fixed. But that's the position now. Those who are still living in manses have a different set of figures that reflect the living in a manse. Please find and read section I.2.3.4. I.2.3.4, referring to study leave. Continuing education is important. It's not a vacation. It's not supposed to be optional. And there is talk that the Office of Vocations will, in the future, be overseeing this in some sort of more regulated way, trying to at least make sure that we take it. Perhaps it's part of good continued standing. It's part of your ability to function effectively in ministry over the long haul. It's part of your self-care. I once had a student, a graduate, come back and say to me, "You didn't teach me how to deal with," and he named a situation. No, because in 3 or 5 years of theological education, we can't possibly teach you how to deal with every situation. How would we have ever taught you how to deal with ministry in a time of COVID? So you need to continually be improving and learning and growing. You should not have to fight for continuing education time. It's there in the call form. But you may have had the experience of following a person who never took that time. The easiest way to go about changing attitudes is to sit down with the Ministry and Personnel Committee and look together at places where your ministry together needs some work, some input, some fresh ideas. And then report back afterwards. Let the congregation know what happened, what you learned, and why it benefited both parties. So that's our introduction to the two main themes of our course this term: polity and professional ethics. Thanks very much.